Hello, welcome back to Essential Skills in Character Rigging. I am your host, Nicholas Zeman, and today I am going to go over your lesson from Chapter 6 in building inverse kinematic structures. Now we're just going to do this for the arm because the legs are fairly straightforward. I don't want to overload you guys in a single video. The first one I know is pretty long, so we're going to make this really short and sweet. So here I've got the skeleton from the previous video, and you can find this file that will be with publisher, and it will be under basichumanskeleton.ma, and you'll be able to open this up and follow along with it. Okay, so I've got this skeleton here, and what I'm doing with the skeletons, I'm going to create some IK solutions. Now, I've got some IK solutions in the book that we can create with the legs, and the legs are a little bit simpler, so we'll just focus on the arm for now. And you can follow along in the book about creating an IK setup for the leg, which is actually fairly simple to do. Alright, so the first thing to know about the arm is that you do not want to include your clavicle node with your IK setup. Not for this one, at least. We can have multiple IK setups and rigs and things like that, but clavicles are something we generally like to independently operate and manipulate. We don't like to have the clavicle as part of the arm IK solution. In fact, most of our IK solutions are 3-bone solutions to 2-bone solutions. IK can get pretty messy and pretty unpredictable at times. So one of the things about IK, and the frustrating things about IK, inverse kinematics that is, that we really sometimes reach a point when it's completely unstable or unpredictable, and we spend more time trying to fix it, right, than we do trying to get it to work or having it work correctly in the way we intend. So the way I always say it is we always need IK for the legs because the feet have to be locked to the ground and the leg has to move around the locked down foot. When forces apply against your character, that's when we want to use inverse kinematics, and that always happens with the legs, unless you're laying on your back, of course. When we're in control of our muscles, we're actually using forward kinematics, meaning that we are moving and rotating the joints based on pure muscle movement. And so the arms, it's debatable. Some animators like to just get rid of the IK altogether because they hate, trying to move around or get around all of the unpredictability of IK and the pull vectors and all that kind of stuff. All right, so we're going to do the simplest form of IK here. Now, what I've also got done here is I have this extra joint here as a twist node. Now, this is not by canon absolutely necessary, but it's actually going to make our life a lot easier later on because we can independently rotate the wrist. And the wrist is pretty important, right, to be able to rotate and manipulate independent of an IK handle. So we're going to do a little trick here that a lot of animators use, and that is to make the IK chain go from the shoulder to the twist node or the forearm node, and then leave the wrist free to animate, but while also moving the entire arm with the IK handle. I'm going to show you how we do this. All right. So the first thing we need to do is go to our skeleton IK handle tool, or create IK handle. Now, what we're doing here is we're determining whether or not we're going to use a single chain solver. And a single chain solver is where when you rotate the IK handle, it will rotate the root node. We really don't want this because we want much finer control over that rotation, especially in that humerus. That humerus is really tricky, and we don't want any computer-driven solution to completely take over the roll action of that humerus. So we're going to create a rotate plane, and this makes it a little bit more complex, but down the road it allows us to create what's called a pull vector constraint, which will then allow us to fine-tune the rolling action of the humerus. And then later on down the road, we're going to completely change the way that deforms by adding in these twist nodes to make it look really nice. Alright, so I'm going to turn off my polygons, and now I'll show you how to create this IK chain. We start with the root node in the chain, click on that, which is the humerus, and we are going to end, not at the wrist, where you would think we would end, but at the forearm. Alright, now you can see here's our IK chain. If I select my IK chain, I will be able to move it. And we can also see what is the pull vector up here. And you can see the pull vector is the plane upon which it's solved. Now that's a really tough thing to try to understand or try to explain or make someone understand in a short amount of time. And it's described in the book a little bit in more detail, because what the rotate plane really does is it allows us to roll the shoulder. It allows us to change the plane upon which this elbow is rotated. So if you got this idea where your character has these chicken wings, right? How am I going to get him to, let's move this in here. Now what I'm doing here is I am moving my IK handle. Now if I move his arm inward, well, what if I want to chicken wing him here and create this kind of action? Not that it's necessarily common, but sometimes we want the elbows to be out, right, and the hands to be in. Alright, so let's just go back here to our initial pullback position. And one of the things you'll find is once you start mucking around with IK, it's really hard to go back to the way it was. Alright, so let's just do that. I undid it one too many times. So I'm just going to go right back to here's our IK handle. Alright, so what's happening as you read in the book is that I'm changing the position of my IK effector, right? And the effector is getting its position based on this handle thing here. And let's bring up my outliner here so you can see. Here's my IK handle. So the IK handle exists outside of the hierarchy. You can move it around. Now this skeleton has not been bound yet, so we're just kind of looking at the way the joints move. And technically speaking, I like to rig my characters before I bind them, or I at least get the bones in there first, and then sometimes I put the IK in afterwards. It just depends on how the character is to be rigged or what I'm doing. But a lot of times IK comes afterwards, so you can really see the action of the character. And in fact, why don't I go ahead and open up one of our scene files. This might make life a little bit easier here. And take me 1 second to find this stuff. It's somewhere in Google Drive. Here we are. And let's just open that up here. This might make life a little bit easier. Now I have a bound skeleton, and you'll learn how to do the bind here. And I have IK on this bind, and now we can see the exception of, and let's just mirror those skin weights. Let's fix that. Alright, that's just going to make it a little bit easier to see what happens. Alright, so what's happening here, and now I've got the same IK handle set up that I had previously. What's happening is when I transform the IK handle, it's telling the effector where to go. Now the effector is running into the IK solution, right? And that IK solution, let's just create this again. So I'm going to show you one little thing here. Where we go from the humerus to the forearm there. So that's telling these two joints where to go. Now, I've set up my joints here. I really want to show you how, if you notice, this degree of freedom, this is pretty important. I go over it in the book a little bit. We have a hinge joint here, and that hinge joint only needs to rotate on the appropriate plane. So what plane do we really need to rotate on? On the z-axis. Now I've turned these degrees of freedom off. Why have I done that? Well, when you create IK, it likes to tend to move it in all three axes at once, and we do not want that elbow to move. Now the humerus we have to have moved. The root node must move in all axes at once. But the elbow, I'm cutting off my degrees of freedom. Why? It just limits it. It makes it more realistic, and it keeps this from wobbling. Now in some IKs, or some mocap solutions and things, we oftentimes have to enable these or get really wonky data. But for right now, we're making a classic rig. And the classic rig means that someone's going to hand animate this. So in order to make sure that our character anatomically works properly, we are not going to let that elbow wobble or move in any weird axis that it's not supposed to move in. That's incorrect. right? That looks pretty painful. Looks like someone just broke their elbow, right? We only want it to rotate in that axis we told it to rotate in. So I'm going to turn off my degrees of freedom there. Right, now we're going to create an IK handle. Remember, we go to the forearm. Now, why do we go to the forearm? Well, now, if we hadn't gone to the forearm, see, we can twist this, but if we had gone to the wrist, we wouldn't be able to independently twist the wrist if that forearm wasn't a bone in the middle. So we really want to keep the wrist independent and able to rotate on its own without affecting the rest of the IK solution. Now we're actually, eventually when we do these twist nodes, we're not going to be twisting the wrist as much as twisting the forearm node here. And we also want that forearm to be able to twist. Why? Because we have what's called a humerus and an ulna, and those work together in order to create the twisting effect of our forearm, allowing our arm to roll fairly significantly in either direction. Alright, so the one thing here that's kind of weird, so we've locked that elbow into that one position. The one thing here that's kind of off, or let's say not finished yet, is that the pivot point for my IK handle is happening at the forearm. This is where I'm going to turn my polygons off here. Alright, so now the forearm here, we really want that pivot point. We want that IK handle to be over here, but we can't move the IK handle, right, to that position. Why? Because it'll address the IK chain. It'll change or update the position of the IK handle, or the effector. So what we need to do is basically say, hey, the pivot of that effector is going to go right there. So this is when we're going to go do a little fancy work, and this is why I use this as a lesson. We're going to go to our hypergraph connections, and we're actually going to select the effector. And we can't move the effector, but we can go to pivot mode, which is function left arrow in your Mac, or it's the option key, insert key on your PC. And we're going to move that pivot using the snap key. Oops. Well, that's what my plan was. Alright. Maybe they changed a little something. We're going to go up here and modify, evaluate node. Let's turn off that IK solver. Now let's move that pivot point. There we go. And now let's modify and turn on our IK solver. Oops, now let's go back to that IK handle. And now we have an IK handle, which is essentially evaluating from the wrist. However, our forearm is free to twist, as is the wrist. Now, one more thing I'm going to show you here. And if you're just getting started in rigging, a lot of this stuff is going to seem like a little crazy or possibly over your head, but try to take it all in stride. We're really learning a process of how the body works and how to set up a 3D character rig to approximate how the body works. And it's really important to understand that, because we can never get anything right. We're making everything approximate the functional anatomy of the human, and there's a lot of different ways to do this. This technique, and the ways that I show you in this book, is very what we call classic, meaning that it doesn't use some of the newer technologies and some of the newer cookie-cutter, out-of-the-box systems and packages. And the reason it doesn't is because you need to learn how to use the correct setup first before you can use some of these automated setups, which are essentially just prefab ways of doing what riggers have been doing for a decade or more, which is just simply creating the best approximation of human anatomy that we can in conjunction with the modelers, using the techniques that are available to us. So now, obviously, there's all kinds of areas up here. They're not deformed properly, and this is not a full, proper deformation bind. This is just a very basic one, and I'm doing this so you can see a little bit better, get a little bit better visualization of what's happening to the body and how it works. Okay, so now the other thing I'm going to show you here is our pole vector constraint. Now, one of the things that's always really annoying about IK is that if you don't set a keyframe here, it's almost impossible to get it back to the position, right? Because it uses global positions. So, how do we get this IK handle back to life? Well, a little trick here. We're going to turn off our IK solver. Now I'm going to go to my bind pose here. Skin, go to bind pose. Boom. Now you won't have a bind pose, of course, unless you've bound it. And we'll learn how to do that in one of the next chapters here. Now, you just have to move this, and boom, it'll just snap out. The IK handle always snaps to where the effector is, which is where this joint is. And if the IK is not on, the effector always follows the joint position. Now we evaluate nodes and just turn those IK solvers back on, boom. Alright, and what I often do to save myself the trouble of doing that is I'll actually just set a keyframe on the translates here. And that way, no matter where I go with it, I can just hit the back button and boom, it goes back to the original bind pose, or the IK version of that bind pose. Alright, so the other thing I'm going to show you, it's a constraint, and we're not going to get to constraints until a little bit down the line, but it's a special, unique kind of constraint. And let's just create a pull vector. We're going to use this locator. Locator is just kind of a null or a blank object, just a point in space. And let's move that back. Usually our pull vector will be lined up with the joint where it is the parent of our IK chain. And I'm going to select my locator there and select my IK and we're going to constrain pull vector. Now what this is going to do is, you can see if I select my IK handle, it's going to draw a line between the IK handle and let's go ahead and show hands here. And what this does is this changes the plane. So think about it as changing where the elbow is rotating. So I move my IK handle, right, and I can see how that arm is swinging down. This is a real frustration with animators. You do something and you say, hey, I'm going to bring his hand up over his head, except I want his elbow to be down. How do we change that? Well, we move that pull vector. Move that pull vector down. Now we can clap his hands. Otherwise, without adjusting that pull vector, it would be very hard to have him clap his hands. And even now, see as it crosses the line of the chest, we have to change the constraint, the pull vector. And there we go. Now we can change, which is essentially the Y rotation of our skeleton here in the humerus. And it's really important because you can either do this or this, and it's a tremendously different posture for a human being. You know, and you can see if these elbows do this really weird swinging thing. And this is really something that frustrates a lot of animators because you're going to have them go from like one position to the other, and you can see how that pull vector just doesn't like crossing. And we're going to some extremes here. I'm just trying to show you. All right, well, what if I want his elbow to be down here? Well, that's what the pull vector does. All right, we can change the plane upon. Let's see. One of the things you really want to avoid doing is trying to do something really weird with the body and then saying, oh my gosh, my rig is broken. Well, I mean, rigs break a lot, but oftentimes let's make sure we're in the normal range of human motion when they do, because it's really easy to get out of normal human range of motion just to try to make it break. So that pull vector constraint with an IK handle is basically just using the direction that the elbow is pointing. You can just think about it as which way the elbow points. And you can have the elbow point in multiple different directions. You can have, this is a natural human motion within the range of human motion, and so is this. And you can see that the effector here of the wrist, it's in the same spot, right? This doesn't move. However, when I change the pull vector, it dramatically changes what's happening. So the position doesn't change, and this is one of the weaknesses of IK with rotate plane, is that the position is the same, so it's solving and evaluating that IK perfectly fine for this position, but on drastically different planes. And it's really how you can understand the nature of the pull vector. Alright, so hope you learned a little something. Just to recap, we created an IK handle using this rotate plane IK, not from the clavicle, but from the humerus to the forearm, not from the humerus to the wrist. And the reason for that is so we can freely rotate our forearm twist, and if we had 4 of these, as we should have at least multiple nodes here, then we can also freely rotate the wrist, but also use our IK system here. The second thing we did is we created a pole vector constraint between our IK handle and this locator, and that means the position of this locator will now control to some degree the plane, because this is going to aim itself to our pole vector. Alright, and that is your first step in understanding inverse kinematics and how it can be used to dramatically speed up your animations by only needing to animate the translate of an IK handle, as opposed to trying to animate the rotation of 1, 2, 3, 4 joints at once. So you get the ease of only animating one node's translate. Now, it comes along with a lot of unpredictability and difficulty in setting up. So a lot of animators like to switch off that IK anytime they want and animate strictly with forward kinematics because it tends to be much, much more predictable.